在习的领导下，您觉得今天的中共党内还有保守派和自由派之争吗？
The notion of there being a conservative faction and a reformist faction within the Chinese leadership is misleading.
胡耀邦、赵紫阳和邓小平被称为是当年中国改革的三驾马车。
There are a lot of, I'll call them misunderstandings, and I don't mean to be polite, about reform and politics in the PRC.
大家好，这里是观点，我是唐奇薇。今天观点节目的嘉宾是前美国国安会亚太事务主任苏葆立先生。他曾在老布什以及克林顿总统执政时出任美国官员，参与制定过许多重大的对华外交政策。苏葆立先生目前正在撰写中共前总书记胡耀邦的传记。他告诉我，在写上一本和美中关系有关的书时，他对胡耀邦产生了浓厚的兴趣，并且最终在7年前开始动笔。从胡耀邦、邓小平到习近平，苏葆立对中共内部的权力斗争有一个什么样的观察？作为一名前美国官员，他笔下的胡耀邦和中文世界的许多胡耀邦传记相比，会有哪些不同？一起来听一听苏葆立先生的观点。
中文世界已经有一些关于胡耀邦的书。作为一名美国前官员，您的视角会和其他一些作者有什么不同呢？
Well, that's a complicated question, actually. People who have written books about Hu Yaobang inside China have to go through an approval process with the party research institutes and so forth. They're the censors, basically. So even Hu Yaobang's daughter, Man Mei, had to go through that process, and she did 2 books on her father, one published in China and the other one published in Hong Kong. The official biography of Hu Yaobang, which wasn't approved until 2015, also had a lot taken out of it, a lot removed by the censors. And I thought that wouldn't be a good idea for an American author or a former government official to have his book censored by the PRC authorities. So I decided, to do it based upon what I could find out outside of China. As a government official, I also had a somewhat different perspective on things. As both an intelligence analyst and a policymaker, I was in the White House for almost 4 years. I got to know how the policy process works. And it's very political, it's very human. It's not a bunch of academics sitting around thinking about strategies. It's people making policies that will work in often changing circumstances. So that gave me a perspective on how the policy process itself would work. And so I thought I'd try to bring that to my study of Hu Yaobang to see, in fact, not what the issues were, but what the personalities were, what the power structure was, and how Hu Yaobang operated in that context.
胡耀邦、赵紫阳和邓小平被称为是当年中国改革的三驾马车。您会如何评价他们之间的关系，以及他们在中国改革进程中各自发挥的作用呢？
There are a lot of, I'll call them misunderstandings, and I don't mean to be impolite, about reform and politics in the PRC. Deng Xiaoping has often been called the architect, the great architect of reform in China. Hu Yaobang was considered to be just somebody that implemented the policies, and Zhao Ziyang did the same. They actually did have different perspectives on reform and different roles to play in the process of reform. And the end result, unfortunately, was that reform was not a survivor. After 1989, there was some economic reform. There was essentially no political reform. And the reputations of all 3 men changed significantly in the public's eyes after those events. So Deng Xiaoping is widely regarded in this country and in the West as a real reformer. But as a matter of fact, some of the things that he did brought an end to reform. at least comprehensive reform or political reform in the People's Republic of China, and that's some of the story that I'm trying to tell in this book.
当年胡耀邦下台最主要的原因是什么？他的下台对当时的中国社会产生了哪些影响呢？
The official reason for Hu Yaobang's fall in 1989 was that he was ineffective in dealing with bourgeois liberalization, 资产阶级自由化. That wasn't the real reason why he fell. The real reason had much more to do with politics at the very topmost level of the PRC government, within the Politburo Standing Committee. Had much, and his relationships there deteriorated to the point that it was no longer possible for him to do the job. Hu was ousted in January, and although there were some student demonstrations in December and a couple of them in early January, it's too cold to do much demonstrations in Beijing in January. There was a growing sense of dissatisfaction in 1986, 1987, 88, and finally in 1989 it began to peak. A lot of dissatisfaction with the lack of reform, particularly after Hu Yaobang's passing. Zhao Ziyang and his team, I think, were very interested in political reform, but they only had a fairly carefully defined idea of what political reform would be all about. And that was basically separation of the party and the government. That was their main goal. And they set about it with considerable planning, but it failed. And Zhao Ziyang also paid the price for the failure of reform in China.
胡耀邦的去世是89民运的一个非常重要的导火线。您觉得6·4镇压让美中双方的政府各自从中学到了什么呢？
I think there are a number of different lessons that were learned. First of all, the leadership, and particularly Deng Xiaoping, and the elders at that time had a very narrow concept of what the relationship with the West should be like. They often used the metaphor of opening the door but making sure that the flies were kept out. They wanted the money, they wanted the expertise, they wanted the investment, they wanted the management skills that the West had developed, but they didn't want to have all of the other things, the aspects of Western culture that they were afraid of. They didn't want democracy, real democracy. They didn't want a parliamentary democracy. They didn't want Hong Kong music. They didn't want women dressed in miniskirts. They didn't want boys to be dressed in bell-bottom pants. I think in the United States and in Western Europe and maybe even in Hong Kong and Japan and elsewhere, there was an expectation that the reform process and the westernization process would go hand in hand, and that China would become more and more like the West in terms of both the lifestyles that were prevalent there and in terms of the ideas that would be tolerated. In other words, there was a hope, an expectation that with economic progress in China would come more political reform, more freedom. After June 4th, when that whole system fell apart and the policy process in China moved backward quite sharply. So there was a great deal of pressure inside the United States on the Congress and on President Bush to take measures to punish China for what it had done. I'm not sure that U.S. PRC relations have actually fully recovered from 1989. There's still this residual sense of distrust. A lot has recovered, but again, in this past year, after the pandemic and so forth, a lot of that distrust has returned.
您在您的新书当中写到，当天安门广场上的硝烟散去，胡耀邦的执政理念，他提倡的改革思想 经济上的、政治上的都随之而去了。在习的领导下，您觉得今天的中共党内还有保守派和自由派之争吗？中共党内的自由派是不是已经消失了呢？
The notion of there being a conservative faction and a reformist faction within the Chinese leadership is misleading. Factions are much more complicated. They are much more personality oriented, and they're harder to track. Just what I've been trying to do, in fact, with this book, is to get people to understand the political system of China in a more complicated and more realistic way. So it wasn't as if, they would meet together and say, okay, all the reformists stand to the right and the conservatives stand to the left. That would never happen, but it wouldn't also instruct you very much. Their relationships were very complicated. One of the most important parts of power within that CCP system is the power to appoint people to important jobs. In order to understand the politics of the period of 1989, it's more important to know who was in charge of the military, who was in charge of the police, who was in charge of the propaganda apparatus, and who was in charge of the general office and the organization department, rather than understanding whether an individual supported reform or conservative. They got the jobs because of their positions and because of their patrons. But it wasn't necessarily so that they pursued a reformist agenda or a conservative agenda. It was a power struggle in the purest sense, mano a mano, person to person, 你死我活. I think the system has not fundamentally changed its structure since that time. The personalities have changed, but the methodology of power, the structure of power is very much the same as it was.
您对习近平执政之下对胡耀邦的定位有一个什么样的观察呢？
After June 4th and the demonstrations and the crackdown, Hu Yaobang's name disappeared. For 16 years, he was a non-person. And gradually, some of his followers, not all of whom were purged, and a lot of intellectuals and people that would be considered progressive, reformist, maybe wanted a constitutional democracy, including his sons, actually. And a number of intellectuals began to promote a reevaluation. So his name began to appear in some Chinese historical magazines like Yanhuan Chunqiu, and on some websites. And gradually, his reputation began to be refurbished. In 2005, on the anniversary of his 90th birthday, the Politburo had a memorial ceremony for him, at which his career was buffed up, and nice things were said. Basically, the same things that Zhao Ziyang said in 1989, but they had a public ceremony. But they didn't allow 2/3 of his biography to be published, and the family and other intellectuals were not satisfied. So they kept up the pressure. And 10 years later, in 2015, when Xi Jinping was the general secretary, the full Politburo Standing Committee, all 7 members, showed up for the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of Hu Yaobang's birth. And what happened at that point was that there was no change in the fundamental basic evaluation of Hu Yaobang. It was still a version of the 1989 funeral oration by Zhao Ziyang. So they didn't say he was a great Marxist. They didn't say he was a great reformer. And they didn't say anything about how he was knocked down. All that remains, unknown. So Xi Jinping absorbed what he wanted of Hu Yaobang's reputation and sort of twisted it, turned it, molded it into something that's more consistent with Xi Jinping's own attitude toward what everybody should think. And that is, the party is the most important thing. Hu Yaobang was loyal. He was a good person. He was honest. He was not corrupt. But they didn't want to say he was a reformer, and we purged him.
我看到您在新书中写到红二代和太子党的兴起，您能谈一谈太子党现象在当代中国政治当中的重要性吗？
Well, Xi Jinping is a 红二代. Hu Deping and Hu Dehua and Ma Mei are all 红二代. That all came about in the 1980s when Chen Yun and others began to look at the younger generation and say, those people came up out of the Cultural Revolution. We don't really trust them. They may have been what they call three kinds of people. And we can't be sure of their background or their loyalty. So maybe it would be better for us to have our own children succeed us. So that began to happen. And during the 80s and 90s, they came flooding into the party, into the military, into the business community. Having a famous father was the key to wealth for many. I think that phenomenon is now beginning to pass, but there are still many in the Huardai, at least I hear, I don't know, that don't really like Xi Jinping because he doesn't really like them. The red second generation is not unified. They have some of the same kinds of disagreements and personal dislikes that their parents had.
您对习近平目前在中共党内和高层之间的一些关系有一个什么样的观察呢？
I know that he has made some changes in terms of eliminating people that he was concerned might be opponents, and established some structures, some leadership small groups, some commissions that put him at the top of a lot of different issue areas, national security, computerization, all kinds of things. Whether that has made him a more powerful leader or just a busier one and a more nervous one, I don't know. But he seems to have convinced a lot of people that his rule, that his tenure at the top of the PRC hierarchy is secure. Not everybody believes that, and a lot of people would prefer not to believe that, but it seems to be so. I'm still stuck back in the 80s, so I'm not keeping track of all of the aspects of the current PRC leadership situation. But I do think that it is also still quite paranoid. It is still zero-sum in many ways. And just looking at how Xi Jinping has dealt with some of his opponents in the last couple of years, they just disappeared, it seems as if the power struggle aspect cannot be disregarded.
回到您写的新书您写到胡耀邦在很多地方都是一个可敬的人，他才华横溢，乐观包容。但是作为政治改革者，他是一个失败者，他的继任者既没有学会，也不被允许去做到更好。您说我们应该去问为什么？为什么？您对这个问题有自己的答案吗？
I don't really have the answer to my own question. Hu Yaobang was never, even though he was general secretary, which is the top position in the party structure, he never really had the balance of power within that system on his side. His relationship to Deng Xiaoping was always one where he knew that at the end of the process, Deng Xiaoping would be the person that would decide it. And he was okay with that because he wasn't personally ambitious. And he understood comprehensive reform way better and earlier than Deng did, and way better and earlier than Zhao Ziyan did. His idea of what needed was to fix the problems that Mao gave us, and then try to develop a system that decides better. And Hu Yaobang was not a person to take punitive approaches to his political adversaries. In other words, he would always say, don't hit people with a stick, don't pull their pigtails. Don't try to undermine them with bad information. He was a decent human being. He was not corrupt, and he did not believe in punishing somebody just because they disagreed with you. And that was unusual. So I think as a reformer, he was one thing. As a politician, he was something else, and he could never quite bring himself to mesh the two together very successfully.
您最希望读者从您的这本书中得到什么样的启发呢？
I would hope that people would understand that politics inside the PRC is every bit as complicated, if not more so, than politics inside the United States. Even though there are no political parties, there's no three branches of government, all the rest. There's a different level of complexity that we should look for and try to understand. I would hope that they would refrain from mirror imaging American politics in their understanding of how the PRC operates. That doesn't mean that we should give them the benefit of the doubt, because they don't always deserve it. But we should try to figure out, better ways of working to improve their understanding of us, as well as our way of understanding them, because the systems are very different. And the better we understand them, I think the better we can make adjustments and avoid some of the problems that have cropped up in the past.
苏葆立先生刚才谈到，过去1年由于疫情等原因，89之后美中之间的很多不信任又回来了。下期观点节目，苏先生将和我们聊一聊他对美中关系的最新观察。我是唐琪薇，感谢收看，也非常欢迎大家留言发表您的观点，转发分享我们的节目。再会。